The year is 1888. In the heart of the dust-choked West, in a town called Redemption, a woman's screams echo against the clappered face of the new church. They called her a sinner, a harlot, an outcast. They tied her to a post, and the sheriff's whip fell again and again, each crack a testament to the town's cruel piety. The townsfolk watched their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and fear. But then, through the dust and the silence, a stranger appeared. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't speak a word. He simply walked through the crowd and did something no one could have ever predicted. The town of Redemption, Arizona, was born from dust desperation and the fiery sermons of the Reverend Theron Jacobs. It clung to the edge of the Sonoran Desert like a stubborn kola cactus, all sharp spines and hidden thirst. Its name was a promise, or perhaps a threat. To the faithful who flocked to Jacobs's banner, it was a sanctuary from the sin-soaked world. To outsiders, it was a place you passed through, quickly feeling the burn of watchful eyes on your back. The heat was a constant, oppressive thing. But on this particular Tuesday, it was the least of Naomi's concerns. The air, thick enough to taste, was a gritty cocktail of sand and bitter piety. It scraped her raw throat as she gasped, the rough fibers of the hemp rope biting into her wrists. The whipping post, a repurposed telegraph pole planted in front of the half-finished church, was a monument to the town's particular brand of salvation. It was meant to be the first thing travelers saw upon entering Redemption, a stark warning against moral trespass. Today, Naomi was the warning. They had dragged her from the small room she rented above the mercantile that morning. The accusation spat from the thin, unforgiving lips of Martha Higgins, the store owner's wife, was as swift as it was damning adultery. The man in question, a traveling patent medicine salesman named Alistair Finch, had been run out of town on a rail at dawn, tarred, feathered, and terrified. For Naomi, the judgment was to be more personal, more visceral. It was to be a spectacle. "Let this be a lesson," Reverend Jacobs' voice boomed across the hushed square. He stood on the steps of his church, a black-clad vulture, surveying his carrion. He was a man carved from granite and brimstone, with a hawk's nose and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, especially not the perceived sins of others. A lesson in the wages of sin. The harlot's path leads only to pain and damnation. Let the holy fire of this punishment cleanse our town of her wickedness. Sheriff Brody stood beside the post, his face a mask of weary duty. He was a big man, with a gut that strained the buttons of his worn vest, and a drooping moustache that hid the permanent downturn of his mouth. He wasn't a man who enjoyed this part of his job, but in Redemption, the law and the gospel were two sides of the same tarnished coin, and Theron Jacobs was the one who flipped it. Brody uncoiled the long leather bullwhip, its tip kissing the dust. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut, her mind a maelstrom of terror and injustice. It wasn't true, not the way they'd painted it. Alistair had been kind, a gentleman who spoke of cities like Chicago and New York, who had treated her not as a commodity but as a woman. He'd read her poetry. They had shared a meal, a conversation, a single stolen kiss that had felt more innocent than sinful. But Martha Higgins, whose own husband's eyes lingered on Naomi far too often, had seen them through the window. In Redemption, the appearance of sin was sin itself. 10 lashes, the Reverend pronounced, his voice ringing with righteous finality. To purge the flesh and save the soul. The crowd murmured a low hum of approval and morbid anticipation. These were her neighbors, the woman who'd sold her flour just last week, the blacksmith who'd mended her bucket, the children she'd sometimes offered a piece of candy. Now they stared their faces hard, their eyes hungry for the spectacle of her humiliation. She saw no mercy in them, only the reflection of the Reverend's fire. Sheriff Brodie sighed a barely audible puff of air. "I'm sorry, miss." He muttered, his voice too low for anyone but her to hear. The first lash was a searing shock, a white-hot bolt of lightning that tore through the thin fabric of her dress and split the skin of her back. A scream was ripped from her lungs before she could stop it. The pain was blinding absolute. It stole the air, the light, the very thought of anything but its exquisite agony. The second lash fell, crossing the first. A fresh wave of fire washed over her. She bit her lip until she tasted the coppery tang of blood, determined not to give them the satisfaction of another scream. Tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the dust caked on her cheeks. By the fifth lash, the world had dissolved into a haze of pain and shimmering heat. The Reverend's voice was a distant drone, the faces of the crowd a blurry, indistinct sea. Her back was a ruin of raw, bleeding flesh. Each breath was a new mountain of pain to climb. Her knees buckled, her body held up only by the ropes that bound her wrists. She was adrift, lost in an ocean of suffering. And then something changed. A subtle shift in the crowd, a ripple of unease that had nothing to do with her. The murmuring didn't stop, but its texture changed. It became less certain, more questioning. A space was opening up, a path being cleared through the tightly packed bodies. Through the curtain of her tears and the fog of her pain, Naomi saw him. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that was at odds with the frantic energy of the day. He was tall and lean, dressed in the simple, trail-worn clothes of a drover or a drifter. A layer of pale dust covered him, from the brim of his low-slung hat to the toes of his scuffed boots, as if he'd been sculpted from the desert itself. His face was unreadable, shadowed by the hat, but it was his stillness that commanded attention. In a town built on loud pronouncements and fervent displays, his silence was a deafening roar. He didn't swagger. He simply walked. The crowd parted for him, as if he were a ghost, their jeers and pious pronouncements dying in their throats. They weren't making way for him out of respect, but out of a sudden, inexplicable uncertainty. He was an unknown quantity, a variable that didn't fit their rigid equation of sin and punishment. Sheriff Brodie had raised the whip for the 6th time. He paused, his arm frozen in mid-air, as the stranger came to a stop just a few feet away. "This is town business, mister," Brodie said, his voice tight. "Keep moving." The stranger didn't respond. He didn't even seem to look at Brodie. His gaze, steady and unnervingly direct, from beneath the shadow of his brim, was fixed on Naomi. It wasn't a look of pity or lust or even anger. It was a look of simple, profound acknowledgement. In that moment, Naomi felt something she hadn't felt since Alistair left. She felt seen. Not as a harlot, not as a symbol, but as a person. "Did you hear me?" Brodie took a half-step forward, trying to reassert his authority. "This ain't your concern." Reverend Jacobs's face had turned a mottled, furious red. "Who is this man? Who dares to interrupt the Lord's justice? Seize him!" "Sheriff." But the sheriff hesitated. There was no weapon in the stranger's hands. His gun belt was tied down the handle of his Colt, worn smooth with use, but he made no move toward it. He just stood there, a silent, immovable object in the path of their righteous fury. His stillness was more intimidating than any drawn weapon. It spoke of a confidence so absolute it had no need for threats. The silent cowboy took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He stopped directly in front of Naomi, so close she could smell the scent of sage and leather and the clean, dry smell of the desert on his clothes. He was a shield, a sudden wall between her and the rest of the world. He still hadn't said a word. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out. Not for his gun, not for the sheriff. He reached for her. His hands were calloused and sure. One hand went to the ropes that bound her left wrist, the other to her right. He didn't try to untie the knots. Instead, he simply took hold of her bound hands, his fingers wrapping around hers. His touch wasn't rough, but it was firm, an anchor in the swirling chaos of her pain. He held her. That was all. He just stood there in front of the entire town of Redemption, in front of the furious reverend and the flustered sheriff, and held the hands of the woman they were whipping. He didn't pull her away. He didn't fight. He simply stood with her, sharing her space, absorbing the hatred of the crowd into his own silent presence. He held her hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world, a simple act of human connection that was in that place and at that time the most radical act of defiance imaginable. The whip in Sheriff Brody's hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He looked from the stranger's back to the Reverend's apoplectic face. To strike now would be to strike them both. The tableau was frozen, the preacher on the steps, the lawman with his whip, the silent cowboy holding the broken woman, and the town of Redemption holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence stretched hotter and more suffocating than the desert sun itself. Time seemed to warp in the oppressive heat. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Each one packed with the unspoken tension of a coiled rattlesnake. The silent stranger, this dusty spectre who had appeared from nowhere, did not flinch. His hands, firm and steady, remained clasped around Naomi's. He was a granite boulder against which the town's fury crashed and broke. Sheriff Brody lowered the whip. The leather drooped its tip, falling limp in the dust. He was a man adrift, his compass of authority spinning wildly. His orders came from the Reverend, but the man before him obeyed a different older law. Brody had seen men like him before, men who carried a profound and dangerous quiet. They were often the last ones standing after the noise, and fury had faded. "I said seize him!" Reverend Jacobs shrieked, his voice cracking with rage. He descended the church steps, his black coat flapping like the wings of a crow. "He is an agent of the devil come to shield the sinner. He mocks this house of God. He mocks our law." A few men in the crowd shuffled their hands, moving uncertainly towards the pistols at their belts. They were farmers and shopkeepers, not gunmen, and the stranger's utter lack of fear was a more potent deterrent than any threat. He hadn't even glanced at them. His entire focus was on Naomi, on the rhythmic, shallow gasps of her breath. "That's enough, Reverend," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had ever contradicted Jacobs in public. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The girls had enough. The lesson's been made. "Enough," Jacobs sputtered, his face inches from the sheriff's. "The law demands 10 lashes. She has received but 5. Do you now presume to interpret the law above God's own minister?" "I'm the one holding the whip, Theron." Brody stated, his tone flat. He didn't back down. The stranger's courage seemed to be infectious. It was then that the stranger finally moved. With painstaking gentleness, he began to work at the knots on Naomi's right wrist. His fingers were surprisingly nimble, coaxing the taut fibers of the rope apart. Naomi watched him through a daze of pain, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. This man was untying her, in front of everyone. "Stop him!" someone yelled from the crowd. A burly man with the beefy arms of a blacksmith, Josiah Kane, started to push his way forward. Before Kane had taken 2 steps, the stranger looked up. He didn't turn his whole body, just his head. The shadow of his hat still obscured his features, but the sheer intensity of his gaze was a physical force. He looked at Kane, and the blacksmith froze mid-stride, a sudden primal caution overriding his righteous anger. The stranger's eyes, now visible, were the color of a stormy sky, and they held a history of violence that Kane wanted no part of. The stranger returned his attention to the ropes. The knot came free. He moved to the other wrist, his movements just as patient, just as deliberate. "Sheriff, for the last time, do your duty," Jacobs commanded. Brody looked at the preacher, then at the stranger, and finally at the raw, bleeding canvas of Naomi's back. A wave of revulsion washed over him, not for the woman, but for himself, for what he had been about to do. He slowly, deliberately began to coil the bullwhip. The message was clear. He was done. With her second hand free, Naomi's legs gave way. She would have collapsed into the dirt if the stranger hadn't caught her. In one fluid motion, he swept an arm around her waist, pulling her trembling, broken body against his. He supported her weight as if she were nothing more than a child. He still had not spoken a single word. He held her there for a moment, letting her find her footing. Then he began to walk, half carrying, half guiding her away from the whipping post. He walked directly toward the center of the crowd, the path he had forged on his arrival. The people of Redemption scrambled backward, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. They were parting for him now, not out of uncertainty, but out of a raw, instinctual fear. "Where do you think you're taking her, mister?" Brody asked, his hand now resting on the butt of his own pistol. It wasn't a threat, but a question. He needed to know. The stranger paused and looked at the sheriff. For the first time, a flicker of something not emotion, but communication passed between them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the livery stable at the far end of the street. Then he turned and continued his slow, inexorable procession. Naomi clung to him, her face buried in the rough fabric of his shirt. The scent of siege and desert dust filled her senses, a clean, earthy smell that was the opposite of the cloying, self-satisfied piety of the town. Each step was agony. The torn skin of her back screaming with every slight movement, but the solid presence of the man beside her was a bulwark against the pain. He was real. He was here. They passed Martha Higgins, who pulled her children close, her face pale with shock and fury. They passed the blacksmith, Josiah Kane, who stood rooted to the spot, his fists clenched at his sides. They passed Reverend Jacobs, who stood trembling with a rage so profound it rendered him speechless. His ultimate humiliation, delivered not by a show of force, but by a whisper of defiance. The silent cowboy, whom the town would later learn was named David, led Naomi into the cool, hay-scented dimness of the livery. The stable boy, a wide-eyed youth named Tim, backed away into an empty stall, his jaw agape. David ignored him. He guided Naomi to a pile of fresh hay in a quiet corner, and with the same care he'd used on the ropes, he helped her sink down to a sitting position, her back against a wooden partition. He left her side for a moment and returned with a bucket of water and a handful of clean rags from a tack box. He knelt in front of her. The world outside the town of redemption seemed to fade away, its angry shouts and judgments muted by the thick wooden walls of the stable. He dipped a rag in the water, wrung it out, and then he paused. His stormy eyes met hers, and in them she saw a question. He was asking for permission. It was a courtesy no one in redemption had ever thought to grant her. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude, of disbelief. She gave a small, shaky nod. Gently he began to clean the dust and blood from her face. His touch was feather-light, a stark contrast to the calloused texture of his hands. He worked in complete silence, his focus absolute. He cleaned the cut on her lip, the tear tracks on her cheeks. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the quiet, dusty livery, surrounded by the gentle sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, his actions spoke a language more powerful than any words. It was the language of compassion, a language the town of redemption had long since forgotten how to speak. The stranger's silent act of defiance had shattered the fragile peace of redemption. The sun beat down on the town square, but the heat of the spectacle had been replaced by a chilling unease. Reverend Jacobs had retreated into his church, the slam of the heavy doors echoing like a gunshot. Sheriff Brodie stood alone by the empty whipping post, coiling and uncoiling his whip, a man wrestling with a ghost. The townsfolk, deprived of their climax, drifted away in small, agitated clusters, their whispers filling the air like the skittering of unseen things in the dust. The Red Dog Saloon, usually quiet until dusk, was buzzing by noon. Men who should have been in their fields or workshops crowded the bar, their voices low and urgent. "Did you see the look in his eyes?" A farmer named Jebediah whispered, wiping foam from his mustache. "Like he could see right through you, to the bone." "He's a gunslinger, has to be," said another. "No ordinary man would have the sand to face down the Reverend like that." Josiah Kane, the blacksmith, slammed his mug on the bar. "Gunslinger or not, he made the sheriff back down. Made us all look like fools. We let him just walk away with that woman." The word harlot died on his lips. After seeing the stranger's intervention, the term felt hollow, childish. At the Mercantile, the conversation was quieter, but no less intense. Martha Higgins recounted the story for the 10th time, her voice shrill with indignation. "He just took her. In broad daylight, it's a disgrace, an affront to all decent people." But even among the women, a current of something other than outrage flowed. A young wife, Sarah, who had watched the whipping with a sick feeling in her stomach, found herself thinking of the stranger's gentle hands. She thought of the way he had looked at Naomi, not with lust, but with something that looked unnervingly like respect. Only one man in town seemed unsurprised. Dr. Alistair MacLeod, a Scotsman with a tidy white beard and eyes that held a scientific skepticism for Jacobs's fire and brimstone theatrics, was in his surgery grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. He had refused to attend the whipping, calling it a barbaric display of public hysteria. His assistant, a young man named Peter, burst in full of the news. "Doctor, you won't believe it. A stranger, a man in dust-caked clothes, he'd just walked right up and stopped the whipping. Took the girl right out from under the sheriff's nose." Dr. MacLeod didn't look up from his work. "And did this stranger draw a weapon, Peter?" "No, sir, not a one. He just stood there, held her hands." The doctor mused. "Sometimes the quietest actions make the most noise. Perhaps a dose of unexpected decency is precisely the medicine this town requires. Meanwhile, in the dim quiet of the livery, David finished cleaning Naomi's face. He worked with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He moved to her back, and Naomi flinched as he gently peeled the tattered, blood-soaked fabric of her dress away from the wounds. The pain was immense, but she gritted her teeth, determined to match his stoicism. He carefully, tenderly began to bathe the lacerations. The cool water was a shock, but then a soothing relief. Naomi had been in redemption for 6 months. She had come from the East, hoping to escape the shadow of a past she never spoke of. She had told people she was a widow, a simple explanation that satisfied their curiosity. The truth was far more complicated. She was the daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia merchant, a man who had lost his fortune and his mind in equal measure. He had promised her to a cruel and powerful business associate, a man old enough to be her grandfather. Naomi had fled, taking with her only a small amount of cash and a single damning piece of evidence, a ledger book that detailed the illegal land grabs and violent intimidation tactics of the man she was supposed to marry, a cattle baron named Jasper Thorne. She had been running ever since hiding in small, insignificant towns. She had thought redemption was insignificant enough. She had been wrong. As David worked, a small, leather-bound object slipped from the inner pocket of his duster, which he had taken off and laid aside. It fell open on the hay-strewn floor. Naomi's gaze was drawn to it. It was a daguerreotype, a portrait of a woman. Her breath hitched in her throat. The woman in the photograph was younger, her face unlined by hardship, but there was no mistaking it. The high cheekbones, the shape of the eyes, the stubborn set of the jaw. It was her mother. Her mind reeled. How could this be her mother had died when she was a child? Who was this silent stranger who carried a picture of a woman he could not possibly have known? At that moment, David looked up. His work finished. He saw where she was staring. He followed her gaze to the photograph on the floor. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of a pain so deep it seemed to suck the air from the stable. He slowly reached down and picked up the daguerreotype, his calloused thumb stroking the image's silver surface. He looked from the face in the photograph to the face of the woman before him. The resemblance was undeniable. He finally spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly thing, rough with disuse, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry riverbed. "My sister," he said, his voice raspy. "Her name was Shreya. She came out west a long time ago, married a man from Philadelphia. I never met him. She died, not long after. I've been looking for her daughter, for my niece." The world tilted on its axis. Naomi stared at him, at this silent, violent, gentle man who had saved her. This man who was impossibly her uncle, the brother her mother had spoken of in hushed, sad whispers, the brother she thought had been lost in the war. Outside, the whispers in the town were growing into a roar. Reverend Jacobs was weaving a sermon of paranoia and fear, painting David not just as a sinner's accomplice, but as a demon sent to test their faith. But inside the stable, a far more profound and dangerous truth had just been unearthed, a truth that would shake the very foundations of redemption and unearth secrets far deadlier than a single stolen kiss. The dust was settling, but a storm was coming. The revelation settled in the thick, dusty air of the livery, a truth more shocking than any violence. Naomi stared at the man before her, this silent stranger, this unexpected savior. Her uncle. The word felt clumsy and alien in her mind, a piece of a life she never knew she had. Her mother Sarah had spoken of her brother David in hushed, melancholic tones, painting him as a brave boy lost to the brutal machinery of the Civil War. He was a ghost, a faded memory, not this formidable presence of dust and leather and quiet resolve. "My mother, she kept your letters?" Naomi finally managed to say, her voice trembling as memory surfaced. "The ones you wrote from camp. She read them to me. She said you wrote about the stars in the south." A flicker of profound sorrow crossed David's face, a deep crack in his stoic facade. "I stopped writing when I couldn't hold a pen. Woke up in a Union field hospital with my arm shattered and my name lost to the records. They listed me as dead at Shiloh. By the time I was whole enough to search, years had passed. I went to Philadelphia. The house was owned by strangers. No one knew where the Vance family had gone." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the raw exhaustion of his long search. "I followed rumors. Whispers of a merchant who'd lost his fortune and a daughter who had fled a terrible marriage contract. I've been on that trail for 3 years. The chasm of their lost years felt immense, filled with unspoken grief. He was the family she thought she'd lost forever, and she was the proof that his sister's light had not been entirely extinguished from the world. In the shared quiet of the stable, a fragile, unspoken bond began to form. But the world outside the livery walls had no time for such tender reunions. Redemption was a powder keg, and Reverend Theron Jacobs was holding the match. Having retreated to his church, he emerged not with a message of peace, but with one of war. He stood on the steps, his Bible held high, his voice a clarion call to fear and hatred. "The serpent has entered our Eden," he roared his voice, carrying across the unnaturally quiet square. "He comes not with horns and a forked tongue, but in the guise of a man. A silent, watchful demon sent to protect the sinner and cast doubt upon the righteous." He laid his hands on the harlot, and with his touch he stained her soul beyond redemption. He defied God's law, and now he hides in the shadows, poisoning our town with his very presence. His words were a potent venom, seeping into the cracks of the town's fear. In the Red Dog Saloon, the talk grew louder, bolder. Josiah Kane, the blacksmith, his earlier hesitation burned away by the Reverend's fire, slammed his fist on the bar. "The sheriff's lost his nerve. That stranger, whoever he is, made a mockery of us all. We can't let him stay. We can't let him harbor that woman in our town." The men around him murmured their assent, their courage bolstered by whiskey and the preacher's permission. Even those who had felt a flicker of doubt were swayed. The stranger's silence, once intimidating, was now painted as sinister. His stillness was not confidence, but the coiled patience of a predator. Jacobs was masterfully turning the man's strength into perceived weakness, his defiance into an act of demonic evil. Sheriff Brody watched from his office, the door ajar. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching shame. He had been a participant in the cruelty, and the stranger's quiet courage had only served to highlight his own weakness. He knew Jacobs was twisting the truth, whipping the town into a frenzy for his own ends, but Brody felt powerless. To stand against the Reverend now was to stand against the entire town. He was one man, and the tide of their fury was rising. Only Dr. MacLeod seemed immune to the hysteria. As he tended to a farmer's sick child in his surgery, he listened to the Reverend's distant tirade with clinical disdain. "Hysteria is a disease more contagious than cholera. Peter, he remarked to his young assistant. "And our good Reverend is a most effective carrier. He offers simple answers to complex fears, and people find that immensely comforting. It is easier to believe in a demon you can burn than to confront the darkness in your own heart." Back in the livery, the growing clamor from the town square was an undeniable threat. Naomi, her back now treated with a soothing salve from David's saddlebags, felt the walls closing in. The brief, miraculous joy of finding her uncle was being crushed by the terrifying reality of their situation. "You have to go," she pleaded, her eyes wide with urgency as she looked at David. "They are coming for you, for both of us. The Reverend will not stop until he has seen you punished or driven out. You don't know him. His pride is everything." "I know the type," David said, his voice a low growl. "Men who wrap themselves in a flag or a Bible to hide the fact that they're empty inside." He looked at her, his expression unyielding. "I didn't spend 3 years searching for my family just to abandon you to a mob." "Then we leave together," she urged. "Now, we can slip out the back. They won't even know we're gone until morning." Before David could answer, a new sound cut through the rising anger of the crowd, the steady, confident cadence of a horse trotting down the main street. It was a sound of purpose and authority that stood in stark contrast to the nervous energy of the town. Through a crack in the livery doors they saw him, a tall, imposing figure on a powerful black horse. He was dressed in a dark, well-fitted suit and a bowler hat, an image of urban civility dropped into the heart of the dusty, chaotic West. A polished silver star on his vest caught the late afternoon sun, winking like a malevolent eye. He rode with an air of absolute assurance, his gaze sweeping over the town, taking in the church, the mob, the sheriff's office, as if it were all an equation he was meant to solve. He dismounted with fluid grace in front of the sheriff's office. Brody stepped out, his face a mixture of apprehension and weariness. The man's voice was as crisp and clean as his suit. "Marshal John Corrigan, U.S. Marshal Service. I have a federal warrant for the arrest of a woman known as Naomi Vance. Information suggests she passed through this town. I am here to take her into custody." If a physical blow had struck her, Naomi could not have been more stunned. A low, guttural sound of despair escaped her lips. "Corrigan," she whispered the name like poison. "He sent Corrigan." David put a steadying hand on her arm, his eyes locked on the scene outside. "Who is he?" "The best," she breathed, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Jasper Thorne doesn't hire second-rate men. Corrigan is relentless, and he is incorruptible. He believes in the law no matter what. If the warrant says I'm a murderer, he will move heaven and earth to bring me in." The careful deception of her life as a simple widow had been torn away. The charge of being a local harlot was now replaced by the far more deadly accusation of being a federal fugitive. Marshal Corrigan would not be deterred by a silent stare or an act of defiance. He was the law incarnate. The storm had finally arrived, breaking not with one but 2 bolts of lightning. In front of the livery, the mob, ignited by Jacobs, was forming ranks, their faces grim, their hands clutching farm tools and old pistols. Torches were being lit, their flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows against the walls. And at the other end of the street, a U.S. Marshal, implacable and determined, stood ready to execute his duty. David found himself caught in the crossfire. He looked at his niece, her face a mask of sheer terror. And he knew he had not found her at the end of his search, but at the beginning of a new, far more dangerous one. The quiet life he might have dreamed of had vanished. All that remained was the reckoning to come. The space between the livery doors, became the edge of the world, a fragile membrane separating a desperate quiet from a rising roar. Through the cracks in the weathered planks at the front, Naomi could see the monstrous, shifting form of the mob. The air grew acrid with the smell of burning pine pitch from their torches, a scent that mingled sickeningly with the sweat of their fear-fueled rage. Josiah Kane, the blacksmith, stood at the forefront, his face a mask of righteous certainty. In the flickering light, the sledgehammer on his shoulder less a tool and more an instrument of judgment. Above them all, orchestrating their hate, Reverend Jacobs directed the symphony of fury, his Bible held high like a conductor's baton. "The Lord's fire will purge this den of sin," he bellowed, his voice cracking with fervor. Burn it all." Through the wide-open back door, a different kind of threat approached. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows, silhouetting two figures walking with deliberate purpose. Sheriff Brody, his movements hesitant, his shotgun held loosely at his side like a borrowed prop, and the implacable Marshal John Corrigan, whose every crisp step was a testament to the unbending authority of the federal law. The world had shrunk to this single building, a tinderbox caught between a wildfire and a glacier. "He owns them all." Naomi whispered the words, a ragged exhalation of despair. Her knuckles were white where she clutched the oilskin-wrapped ledger to her chest, a pathetic shield against the coming storm. The sight of the marshal had brought back the chilling memory of Jasper Thorne's study, the smell of cigar smoke and leather, the cold, dead eyes that promised ruin with a polite smile. Judges, senators, lawmen. A warrant from Jasper Thorne is not an accusation. It's a death sentence delivered in advance. Corrigan will believe it. He has to. It's the law. David didn't answer immediately. He methodically ejected the spent casing from his Colt and replaced it with a fresh cartridge, the crisp metallic clicks slicing through the tension. Each click was a punctuation mark in a deadly sentence yet to be written. He was no longer just a drifter, he was a guardian. The long, lonely years of searching had hardened into a singular purpose in this dusty, hay-scented air. He slid the pistol back into its worn holster, his movements fluid and economical. The paper says what Thorne wants it to say. He finally rumbled, his gaze fixed on the approaching lawman, his voice a low counterpoint to the mob's hysteria. "We know the truth. Truth is a poor shield against a bullet, David," she countered, her voice cracking. The weight of her flight, the months of looking over her shoulder, pressed down on her. "What good is the truth when you're in the ground? It's the only thing you take with you," he said, a grim finality in his tone. "Maybe it's a good thing to die for." Their quiet, desperate debate was cut short as Brody and Corrigan reached the back entrance, stopping just outside the fall of shadow. "David." Brody's voice was strained, a plea from a man caught in a vice of his own making. "You need to listen. This is U.S. Marshal Corrigan. He isn't a man you can stare down. He has a federal warrant for the woman's arrest." Brody paused, swallowing hard before forcing the words out. "For robbery and the murder of a geologist named Abernathy in the Colorado Territory." "It's a lie. Abernathy was never in Colorado," Naomi cried out from the livery's depths, her voice filled with the raw anguish of the falsely accused. Marshal Corrigan stepped forward, his piercing blue eyes methodically scanning the darkness within the stable. He was a man who dealt in facts, not emotions. "That's a matter for a federal judge to decide, ma'am," he stated, his tone inflexible, devoid of sympathy. "My duty is to execute this warrant. My advice to you both is to come out with your hands raised. I can guarantee your safety from that mob. I cannot guarantee it from what comes next, if you refuse." At the front, a heavy, splintering thud shook the large double doors as Josiah Kane swung his sledgehammer. "In the name of the people of redemption, open these doors!" he roared, his voice amplified by the eager chorus of the mob. "You're trapped, David," Brody pleaded, taking a half step closer. "For God's sake, don't make this a bloodbath. There's nowhere left to run." David looked from the desperate terror in Naomi's eyes to the precious ledger she held, and then back to the unwavering figure of the marshal. He saw the cold logic in Corrigan's eyes, the unshakable belief in the paper he carried. A plan as thin as a razor's edge and just as dangerous coalesced in his mind. He was a man of action, but this moment called for something more. It called for the right words, aimed as precisely as any bullet. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a deep, resonant boom that carried with surprising force from the darkness, startling the lawman and even causing a momentary lull in the mob's clamor. "Marshal Corrigan!" Corrigan stiffened his hand, moving to rest on the butt of his holstered pistol, a reflexive gesture of a man accustomed to trouble. "I'm listening. The warrant in your hand is a lie, bought and paid for by a man named Jasper Thorne. Thorne's name carries weight." Corrigan admitted his curiosity, clearly piqued despite his professional composure. "But it doesn't invalidate a federal warrant. You'll need more than accusations from a man hiding in a barn." "I have more." David's voice boomed again, each word carefully chosen. "The woman you're here to arrest has proof. Thorne's personal ledger. It details every crime, every bribe, every land grab. And it details the real murder of geologist Abernathy. The one Thorne committed and then framed her for." The words hung in the air, drifting over the mob at the front like a sudden chilling wind. A wave of confusion rippled through them. This was no longer a simple tale of a harlot and her demonic protector. This was about ledgers, powerful men, and murder, a story far more complex and dangerous than the one their preacher had fed them. They looked at each other, their righteous fury beginning to curdle into a nervous, uncertain silence. Reverend Jacobs's face, illuminated by the torchlight, went slack. The name Jasper Thorne, spoken aloud in this place, was the sound of his doom. His entire position in redemption, the church built on a foundation of lies. The power he wielded, the respect he commanded, was financed by Thorne's blood money. Naomi was a loose end Thorne had ordered him to dispose of quietly. This public spectacle had unraveled everything. Lies. The desperate lies of the devil. He shrieked, his voice climbing an octave with panic. "Pay them no mind. He is trying to poison your souls with his falsehoods. Burn them out." But the seed of doubt had been planted. And just as Jacobs tried to regain control, another voice, calm and rational, cut through the night. "He is telling the truth." Every head turned. Dr. Alastair MacLeod stepped out from the deep shadows of his surgery, holding a lantern high. The steady, clean light seemed to push back against the wild, flickering flames of the mob's torches, a small beacon of reason in a sea of hysteria. "Marshal," the doctor said, his Scottish brogue clear and steady as he addressed Corrigan directly. "The man they accuse this woman of killing geologist Abernathy was never in Colorado last month. He was right here in this town. He was working for Jasper Thorne, surveying the aquifer." Dr. MacLeod paused, letting the weight of his words sink in his gaze, sweeping over the silent crowd. "He confided in me. He was a man of science, not easily given to dramatics. but he was disturbed. He said he had found incontrovertible proof that Thorne was constructing an illegal dam upstream to divert the river, a theft of water that would bankrupt every ranch for 50 miles. Abernathy was a man of conscience. He was going to expose him. Marshal Corrigan's eyes narrowed to slits. He was a hunter of men, and he could smell the stench of a vast and rotten conspiracy. The pieces were falling into place: the flimsy warrant, the overzealous preacher, the mob. And what happened to this man of conscience, Doctor? Dr. MacLeod's gaze shifted, landing squarely on the now trembling Reverend Jacobs. He had a most unfortunate accident on the trail a few days later. A fall, they said. Reverend Jacobs was the one who found the body and hastily arranged the burial. He told Sheriff Brody that it was a simple tragedy and that no examination was necessary. The web was complete. The warrant, the girl, the cattle baron, the preacher, the dead geologist. It was a tapestry of corruption, and Corrigan now held all the threads. "Reverend Jacobs," he said, his voice dropping to a lethally cold temperature that carried across the square. "It appears you and I have a great deal to discuss." Exposed, cornered, and stripped of his authority, Jacobs lost himself to pure animal panic. With a wild cry, he lunged toward Josiah Kane, snatching the pistol from the blacksmith's belt. "The sinners must be purged," he screamed, whirling and aiming the gun not at the livery, but directly at the figure of the U.S. Marshal. He never fired. A single deafening shot cracked from the darkness of the stable, a sound so sharp and final it seemed to split the night in two. The pistol flew from the Reverend's grasp in a spray of blood and splintered wood. Jacobs stared at his mangled hand for a second, in disbelief, before collapsing to his knees, howling in agony and shock. The spell was shattered. The mob, their leader now, a writhing, disgraced man, their cause revealed as a lie, simply dissolved. They stared at their fallen prophet, then at the smoking entrance to the livery, and then at each other. Shame and fear replaced their fury. Torches were dropped, tools lowered. The monstrous beast was dead, leaving only a group of confused and frightened townsfolk in its place. David stepped out from the livery, his Colt held loosely at his side, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel. Naomi emerged behind him, blinking in the firelight, her head held high. They walked through the cowering remnants of the mob, who parted for them like the Red Sea. David stopped a few feet from Corrigan. Naomi stepped forward and held out the oilskin-wrapped ledger. "This is the proof," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's all in there. The names, the dates, the amounts, the truth." Corrigan took the book. For a long moment he looked from the ledger to David's smoking pistol, then to the whimpering preacher being tended to by a stunned Sheriff Brody. Finally, he looked down at the official warrant in his other hand, a document that now felt like a piece of fiction. "My warrant," Corrigan said slowly, his voice resonating with grim authority, "is for a murderer. I see no murderer here. I see a man who just saved the life of a federal officer and a woman who has delivered the key to dismantling a criminal empire." With a decisive rip, he tore the warrant in two, then in four, and let the pieces flutter into the dust. "My business in redemption is concluded. My next stop is the Circle T Ranch. With this ledger, the U.S. Attorney is going to have a very long and productive conversation with Mr. Jasper Thorne." He turned to a visibly relieved Sheriff Brody. "Sheriff, place that man under arrest. The charges are conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of a federal investigation." Brody nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time all day. "My pleasure, Marshal. My distinct pleasure." In the cool, quiet aftermath, as the townsfolk slunk back to their homes to reckon with their night of madness. David and Naomi stood alone under the vast, star-dusted sky. The danger had passed, but nothing would ever be the same. He had found his family. She had found her freedom. David bought the 2 best horses the livery had to offer, as the first blush of dawn began to erase the stars. They rode west, away from the town that called itself Redemption. They didn't look back, leaving the name as a bitter irony for the people who remained. They were riding into an unknown future, but they were riding into it together, their path illuminated not by burning torches of hate, but by the quiet, resilient light of a truth they had fought for and won. The reckoning was over. Their journey had just begun. And so Naomi and David rode out of the town that called itself Redemption, leaving behind the ashes of hypocrisy and lies. They entered the desert not as a harlot and a drifter, but as family, as survivors forged in the fire of a town's cruel judgment. Their story is a powerful reminder that true justice isn't always found in a sheriff's badge or a preacher's sermon. Sometimes it's found in a quiet act of defiance, in the courage to stand for what is right, even when you stand alone. It's a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands and in the darkest of times, compassion can be the most powerful weapon of all. What do you think happens to Naomi and David next on their journey? Let me know in the comments below. If this story of courage and unlikely justice moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from the heart of the Wild West. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening.